October 1944. The European theater was drowning in mud, blood, and the broken promises of commanders who thought victory was just one more offensive away. And in the Belgian lowlands, 30,000 American soldiers were about to learn what happens when arrogance meets reality on a battlefield designed by nature to kill. The rain came down like bullets that day. Not the gentle autumn drizzle that poets write about, but sheets of cold water that turned foxholes into graves and roads into rivers of despair. Somewhere in that gray nightmare, Major General Charles Foulkes stood over a map that made no sense anymore because the water had washed away half the landmarks. His Canadian forces were supposed to be clearing the Scheldt estuary, opening the port of Antwerp so the Allies could finally feed their starving supply lines. But now, his radio crackled with something that made his blood run colder than the October rain. American troops were trapped. 30,000 of them. Cut off by German counterattacks that had come out of nowhere, surrounded on three sides with their backs against flooded polders that would swallow them whole if they tried to retreat. And the man who was supposed to be coordinating the entire operation, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, was 70 miles away, probably sipping tea and studying maps that bore no resemblance to the hell his decisions had created. You need to understand something about Montgomery. This wasn't just another British general with a fancy title and a taste for glory. This was the man who'd beaten Rommel at El Alamein, who'd convinced himself that his genius was the reason the Allies were winning the war. He wore his arrogance like a medal, and he just made a decision that was about to kill 30,000 men if someone didn't stop him. The decision was simple, elegant, and completely insane. Montgomery had ordered the American forces to push forward through a gap in the German lines, a gap he insisted was there based on intelligence reports that were 3 days old. 3 days might as well be 3 years in modern warfare, where front lines shift like sand and intelligence goes stale faster than bread in the rain. But Montgomery was certain. He was always certain. And certainty when you're wrong is just another word for massacre. Foulkes had seen the German positions with his own eyes. There was no gap. There was a carefully prepared killing zone, a funnel that would channel those American boys directly into concentrated fire from artillery, machine guns, and the kind of defensive positions the Germans built when they knew they were fighting for their lives. The Americans were walking into a trap, and Montgomery either couldn't see it or didn't care because it didn't fit his vision of how the campaign should unfold. The radio crackled again. An American colonel, his voice breaking with static and something worse than fear. Desperation. They'd followed Montgomery's orders. They'd pushed into that gap and now they were surrounded, taking casualties by the minute, watching their ammunition run low while German reinforcements poured in from 3 directions. The colonel didn't say it directly because military protocol wouldn't allow it, but Foulkes could hear the truth beneath the words. They needed help and they needed it now or they were all going to die in this godforsaken swamp. Foulkes made a decision that would define his entire career. He was going to ignore Montgomery's orders. Not question them, not request clarification, but flat out ignore them and do what needed to be done. In any normal military hierarchy this was career suicide. You didn't ignore Field Marshal Montgomery. You didn't take your forces off their assigned mission and redirect them to save someone else's troops without explicit authorization. But Foulkes looked at that map, listened to that desperate radio transmission, and decided that 30,000 lives mattered more than his career, more than protocol, more than Montgomery's pride. He called his staff together. These were men who'd been fighting since Normandy, who'd seen enough death to last 10 lifetimes, who knew the difference between following orders and following conscience. Foulkes didn't give them a speech about duty or honor or any of that nonsense. He just told them the truth. American troops were dying. They could reach them. Montgomery would be furious. Anyone who wanted to object should speak now because once they started, there was no turning back. Nobody objected. They'd all heard the radio transmissions. They'd all seen what happened when generals played games with other people's lives. So they moved, Canadian forces peeling away from their assigned objectives and racing toward the trapped Americans through terrain that should have been impossible to cross. The Germans had flooded the polders deliberately, turning the Dutch landscape into a maze of water obstacles that could stop an army in its tracks. But Foulkes had engineers who knew how to improvise, infantrymen who could fight in water up to their waists, and officers who understood that speed was the only weapon that mattered now. The 1st Canadian units reached the American perimeter just as the sun was setting, though you couldn't really tell because the clouds were so thick the whole world looked like twilight. The Germans were pressing in from 3 sides, their artillery zeroed in on the American positions, their machine guns cutting down anyone who tried to move. The Canadians hit them from the flank, not with overwhelming numbers because Foulkes couldn't spare overwhelming numbers, but with the kind of ferocity that comes from knowing you're fighting to save lives, not take territory. The battle that followed doesn't appear in most history books. It didn't have a fancy name or strategic significance that military historians could debate for decades. It was just a brutal, close-quarters fight in the mud and rain, where men killed each other with bayonets because their rifles were too clogged with mud to fire, where the wounded drowned in shell craters because there was nobody left to pull them out. The Canadians pushed forward, yard by bloody yard, opening a corridor through the German positions just wide enough for the Americans to start pulling back. But here's what makes this story matter. While Canadian soldiers were dying to save those American troops, Montgomery was receiving reports that his plan wasn't working. The gap he'd been so certain about didn't exist. The intelligence was wrong. His orders had sent those Americans into a trap. And now, General Foulkes had ignored his directives and diverted forces without authorization to fix a problem that Montgomery's arrogance had created. You might think Montgomery would be grateful. You might think he'd recognize that Foulkes had just prevented a catastrophe. But that's not how men like Montgomery operate. To admit that Foulkes was right meant admitting that Montgomery was wrong, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery didn't do wrong. He didn't make mistakes. His plans didn't fail, they were simply executed poorly by subordinates who lacked his vision. Montgomery's reaction when he finally learned what Foulkes had done was cold fury. Not relief that 30,000 men were saved. Not gratitude toward the Canadians who'd given their lives to correct his error. Just anger that someone had dared to question his judgment, to act independently, to demonstrate that his infallible strategy had been anything but infallible. He demanded an explanation. He wanted Foulkes in front of him immediately to account for this breach of protocol, this unauthorized redeployment of forces, this insubordination that undermined his authority. The fact that every single one of those 30,000 American soldiers was alive because of what Foulkes did didn't enter into Montgomery's calculations. What mattered was the principle of command, the chain of authority, the sanctity of orders from a superior officer. Foulkes arrived at Montgomery's headquarters covered in mud, exhausted from 48 hours without sleep, and utterly unwilling to apologize. He'd brought casualty reports, radio transcripts, maps showing the actual German positions versus what Montgomery's intelligence had claimed. He laid it all out on Montgomery's pristine desk, probably getting mud on papers that Montgomery's staff would spend hours cleaning, and waited for the explosion. Montgomery didn't explode. That would have been too emotional, too human. Instead he went cold. He listened to Foulkes' report with the kind of icy silence that makes grown men uncomfortable, and then he did something that revealed everything about who he really was. He ignored the evidence. All of it. The casualty reports, the radio transcripts, the maps that proved his intelligence was wrong. Montgomery simply dismissed them as irrelevant to the larger strategic picture, as details that Foulkes was too focused on operations to understand properly. And then came the fatal error. Not the error of sending Americans into a trap, though that was bad enough. Not the error of refusing to admit he was wrong, though that would cost lives in future operations. The fatal error was what Montgomery did next, a decision so petty and vindictive that it would haunt him for the rest of his military career. He recommended that Foulkes be removed from command. Not court-martialed, because that would require explaining why, and explaining why would mean admitting what really happened. But Montgomery used his influence, his connections, his reputation as the hero of El Alamein to quietly suggest that General Foulkes lacked the temperament for high command, that he was too impulsive, too willing to deviate from orders, too focused on tactical concerns instead of strategic vision. The recommendation didn't take immediate effect. Other officers knew what had really happened. The American commander whose troops Foulkes had saved wrote a report praising the Canadian general's courage and decisive action. Soldiers who'd been there told the story to anyone who would listen. But Montgomery's influence was enormous, and in the careful bureaucracy of military politics, reputation matters more than truth. Foulkes survived, but his career was effectively capped. He'd never rise higher, never command larger forces, never get the recognition he deserved because Montgomery had marked him as unreliable. And Montgomery continued on, planning more operations, making more decisions based on intelligence he refused to question and strategies he refused to modify because admitting error wasn't part of his psychological makeup. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because Montgomery's fatal error wasn't just about one general's career. It was about a pattern of behavior that would repeat itself throughout the rest of the war. 6 months later, Montgomery would plan Operation Market Garden, perhaps the most disastrous Allied operation of the entire European campaign. He would ignore intelligence about German forces in Arnhem, dismiss concerns from subordinates who questioned his timeline, and send British paratroopers into a battle they couldn't win because the plan looked beautiful on paper and Montgomery refused to believe reality could interfere with his vision. Market Garden would fail catastrophically. Thousands would die. An entire airborne division would be destroyed. And through it all, Montgomery would maintain that the operation had been 90% successful, that only the failure of others to execute his brilliant plan had prevented complete victory. The man had learned nothing from those 30,000 Americans he'd almost killed, nothing from Foulkes' unauthorized rescue, nothing from the evidence that had piled up showing his intelligence was flawed and his strategic vision was blinded by ego. The American soldiers who were saved that day in October 1944 went on to fight through the Bulge, across the Rhine and into Germany. Most of them survived the war. They went home to families who never knew how close they'd come to receiving telegraph notifications instead of reunions. They told their children and grandchildren about the war, but most of them didn't know the name Charles Foulkes. They didn't know that a Canadian general had risked everything to save them. They just knew that somehow, when things seemed hopeless, help had arrived. Foulkes himself rarely talked about it. Canadian officers weren't encouraged to criticize British commanders, especially ones as famous as Montgomery. The official records were carefully written to avoid making anyone look bad, to smooth over the conflict between Montgomery's orders and Foulkes' actions. History was being written in real time, and the victors were already deciding which stories would be told and which would be quietly buried. But the soldiers knew. The men who'd been there, who'd fought in that mud and rain, who'd seen Canadian troops appear out of nowhere to pull them out of a trap that should have killed them all, they knew. And they told the story in letters home, in conversations after the war, in memoirs that nobody would publish because they contradicted the official narrative about Allied unity and brilliant leadership. Here's what really happened that day, stripped of all the military terminology and strategic analysis. A Canadian general looked at orders that would kill 30,000 men and decided that orders could go to hell. He moved his forces without permission, risked his career and the careers of everyone who followed him, and saved lives that every official military calculation said were already lost. And when the supreme commander whose orders he'd ignored demanded an explanation, Foulkes refused to apologize because he knew he'd done the right thing and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to save Montgomery's pride. Montgomery's reaction revealed everything about the difference between leadership and authority. Authority demands obedience regardless of circumstances. Leadership earns respect through wisdom and the courage to admit error. Montgomery had authority in abundance. He could end careers with a word, redirect entire armies with a signature, shape the official history that would be taught in military academies for generations. But he lacked the one quality that separates great commanders from merely competent ones. He couldn't admit when he was wrong. That inability, that fatal flaw, would cost lives throughout the rest of the war. Every time Montgomery made a decision based on flawed intelligence or wishful thinking, his subordinates faced an impossible choice. Follow orders and watch men die, or do what Foulkes did and risk everything to save them. Most chose to follow orders. Military discipline demanded it. Career survival depended on it. Only a few had Foulkes' courage to look at the bigger picture and realize that some things matter more than protocol. The truly tragic part is that Montgomery never learned. After the war he wrote his memoirs. They're masterpieces of self-justification, carefully crafted narratives where every victory was his genius and every setback was someone else's failure. The incident with Foulkes and the 30,000 Americans doesn't appear anywhere in those pages. It's been erased, written out of history by a man who couldn't tolerate any story where he wasn't the hero. But the story survived anyway, passed down through Canadian military records, through American after-action reports, through the memories of men who were there and knew what really happened. It survived because truth has a way of outlasting propaganda, because soldiers talk to each other across national boundaries, because at some fundamental level, people recognize the difference between someone who saves lives and someone who protects their reputation at any cost. Charles Foulkes ended the war as a general, commanded Canadian forces in post-war Europe, and eventually retired with honor. But he never got the recognition he deserved for that day in October 1944. The official histories barely mention it. Most Canadians don't know his name. And the 30,000 American soldiers he saved probably never knew they owed their lives to a man who was willing to sacrifice his career rather than follow orders that would kill them. Montgomery lived to be 88, died covered in honors, and was buried with full military ceremony. History remembers him as one of Britain's great World War II commanders, the man who stopped Rommel and helped liberate Europe. The failure at Market Garden is treated as a minor footnote, an ambitious plan that just didn't quite work out. His vindictive response to Foulkes' life-saving initiative is buried in classified files that most historians never bother to examine. This is how history works. The powerful write their own stories. The brave often die unrecognized. And the truth gets buried under layers of official reports and carefully managed narratives designed to make everyone look good, or at least to avoid making important people look bad. But sometimes, decades later, someone digs through those old files. Someone interviews the survivors before they're all gone. Someone pieces together what really happened from radio logs and casualty reports and the scattered testimonies of men who saw it firsthand. And when that happens, when the truth finally comes out, it reveals something important about war, leadership, and human nature. War isn't really about grand strategies and brilliant tactics. It's about moments when someone has to decide whether to follow orders or follow their conscience. It's about whether you prioritize your career or other people's lives when those two things come into conflict. It's about whether you can admit when you're wrong, or whether your ego is more important than the truth. Montgomery failed that test. He had every advantage: rank, experience, reputation, the respect of Allied commanders and political leaders. But when faced with evidence that his orders were killing men, he chose to protect his image instead of saving lives. When confronted by a subordinate who'd ignored his directives to prevent a massacre, he responded with vindictiveness instead of gratitude. And when given the opportunity to learn from his mistake, he doubled down on the same patterns that would lead to Market Garden and more unnecessary deaths. Foulkes passed that test. He had everything to lose: his career, his reputation, possibly his freedom if Montgomery had pushed for court-martial. But when faced with the choice between following orders and saving 30,000 lives, he didn't hesitate. He knew what was right and he did it, regardless of the personal cost. That's the story that history should remember. Not another tale of Montgomery's genius or another battle where British forces demonstrated their courage. But a story about a Canadian general who looked at a terrible situation, recognized that following orders would lead to catastrophe, and had the moral courage to do what was necessary even when it meant defying one of the most powerful military commanders in the Allied forces. The 30,000 American soldiers who survived went home. They raised families, built businesses, lived the lives they would have been denied if Foulkes had followed orders. Their children and grandchildren exist because one man decided that saving lives mattered more than military protocol. That's not just history. That's legacy. That's what leadership actually means when you strip away all the rhetoric and examine what people do when the stakes are life and death. Montgomery's fatal error wasn't a tactical mistake. It wasn't bad intelligence or poor planning or any of the normal failures that happen in war. His fatal error was being so invested in his own infallibility that he couldn't recognize wisdom when it came from someone else, couldn't admit error when confronted with evidence, couldn't respond to life-saving initiative with anything but petty vindictiveness. That error, repeated throughout his career, cost lives that could have been saved and damaged the effectiveness of Allied operations throughout the final year of the war. The tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. Montgomery could have acknowledged that Foulkes was right. He could have thanked him for preventing a disaster. He could have used the incident to improve his intelligence gathering and decision-making processes. He could have learned, grown, and become a better commander. But men like Montgomery rarely learn because learning requires admitting you were wrong, and admitting you were wrong requires a kind of humility that Montgomery never possessed. So the pattern continued. More operations planned with flawed intelligence. More subordinates faced with impossible choices between loyalty and conscience. More lives lost because one man's ego was too fragile to tolerate dissent or acknowledge error. And through it all, Montgomery maintained his reputation, protected his legacy, and ensured that official history would remember him as a brilliant commander rather than a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked arrogance. But the soldiers remember. The ones who were there, who saw what really happened, who understood the difference between generals who care about victory and generals who care about vindication. They remember and they tell the stories, and gradually, piece by piece, the truth comes out. Not in official histories or military academy textbooks, but in personal memoirs and unit histories and the kind of oral tradition that soldiers pass down through generations. This is one of those stories. A story about 30,000 lives that hung in the balance while two generals made choices that defined who they really were. One chose to save lives at the cost of his career. The other chose to protect his reputation at the cost of lives and learning and basic human decency. History officially remembers the second general as the hero. But the soldiers who were there, the ones who understand what really matters, remember the first. And that's the truth that Montgomery's fatal error couldn't erase, no matter how carefully he crafted his memoirs or how thoroughly he worked to protect his legacy. You can't hide the truth from the people who lived it. You can't write them out of history when they were the ones who made history possible. And you can't pretend that protecting your ego is more important than protecting lives when 30,000 men owe their survival to someone who understood the difference. The years passed. The veterans grew old. They gathered at reunions, fewer of them each time, their numbers thinning as age did what German bullets couldn't. They told their stories to anyone who would listen, but mostly they told them to each other because only another soldier could understand what it meant to be trapped in that Belgian hell with water rising and ammunition running low and the certainty that nobody was coming to save you. And then they did come. Canadian soldiers appearing through the rain like ghosts, fighting their way through German positions that should have been impenetrable, opening a corridor just wide enough to pull 30,000 men back from the edge of annihilation. The Americans who lived through it never forgot that moment. The relief, the gratitude, the overwhelming sense that someone had cared enough to risk everything for them. Some of them tried to find Foulkes after the war. They wanted to thank him personally, to shake his hand, to tell him what his decision meant. Most never found him. Foulkes didn't seek recognition. He'd done what needed to be done and that was enough. He didn't need parades or medals or his name in history books. He just needed to know that those men went home to their families instead of dying in a Belgian swamp because another general's pride was more important than their lives. Montgomery died without ever acknowledging what really happened. His memoirs painted a picture of flawless leadership and brilliant strategy, with occasional setbacks attributed to subordinates who lacked his vision or failed to execute his perfect plans. The incident with Foulkes disappeared from his official record as thoroughly as if it had never happened. But absence tells its own story. The gaps in Montgomery's account, the operations he glosses over, the decisions he doesn't explain, they speak louder than anything he chose to include. The 30,000 men who survived became fathers and grandfathers. They built the post-war world with hands that should have been buried in Belgian mud. Their children inherited a future that almost didn't exist. Their grandchildren carry DNA that should have been extinguished in October 1944. Every one of them is a testament to what happens when one person chooses conscience over career, courage over compliance, lives over legacy. That's Montgomery's real fatal error. Not the tactical mistakes or the flawed intelligence or even the vindictive response to being proven wrong. His fatal error was failing to understand that history isn't written by field marshals in their memoirs. It's written by the people who lived through it, by the soldiers who survived because someone made the hard choice, by the families who exist because courage mattered more than protocol. Foulkes understood that. He looked at those 30,000 lives and saw fathers and sons and brothers and husbands. He saw futures that deserved to exist. He saw a choice that wasn't really a choice at all because there's only one right answer when you're deciding between orders and lives. Montgomery looked at the same situation and saw his reputation, his authority, his carefully constructed image of infallibility. He saw a challenge to his judgment that couldn't be tolerated. Two men. One moment. A decision that defined everything about who they were and what they valued. History chose to celebrate the wrong one, but history has a way of correcting itself. The truth seeps out through cracks in the official narrative. The real stories emerge from forgotten files and fading memories. And gradually, people begin to understand that the greatest acts of leadership often happen in defiance of authority, not in service to it. This is how we honor the 30,000. Not by pretending Montgomery was a hero he never was, but by remembering the man who actually saved them. Not by accepting the sanitized version of events that protects reputations at the cost of truth, but by telling the story of what really happened when one general's arrogance almost killed an army and another general's courage prevented it. Charles Foulkes saved 30,000 American soldiers on a day in October 1944 when the rain fell like the end of the world and death seemed inevitable. He did it by ignoring orders, risking everything, and understanding that some things matter more than careers or protocols or the approval of superior officers. Montgomery's fatal error was failing to learn from that, failing to recognize wisdom when it contradicted his plans, failing to understand that true leadership isn't about being infallible but about being willing to admit error and grow from it. The soldiers who were saved that day are almost all gone now. Their children are grandparents. Their grandchildren are building their own families. The ripple effect of Foulkes' decision extends through generations, countless lives that exist because one man made the right choice at the right moment for the right reasons. That's his legacy. Not in history books or military academies or official commemorations, but in the living proof that courage and conscience still matter when everything else has failed. Montgomery's legacy is more complicated. He won battles and helped secure victory in Europe. But he also showed us the dangers of unchecked ego, the cost of refusing to learn, the tragedy of choosing image over substance. His fatal error echoes through military history as a warning about what happens when authority becomes divorced from wisdom, when reputation matters more than results, when pride prevents the kind of growth that separates great commanders from merely competent ones. This is the story they should teach in military academies. Not as a lesson in tactics or strategy, but as a case study in moral courage. What do you do when following orders means watching men die? What do you do when the choice is between your career and 30,000 lives? What do you do when the person giving the orders is wrong and refuses to admit it? Foulkes gave us the answer. You do what's right. You pay the price. You accept the consequences. And you sleep at night knowing that somewhere, 30,000 men went home to their families because you had the courage to disobey. That's leadership. That's the difference between commanders who protect their men and commanders who protect their reputations. That's why Charles Foulkes deserves to be remembered, and why Montgomery's fatal error should never be forgotten. The rain stopped eventually. The mud dried. The bodies were buried. The war ended. But the truth remained, carried forward by the men who lived it, preserved in their memories and their stories and their determination to honor the general who saved them by refusing to let history forget what really happened. 30,000 lives. One man's courage. Another man's fatal error. That's the story. Simple, terrible, and true.